Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to our lecture series on Japanese history. And today we're going to be talking about the Heian period, which lasted from 794 until 1185. Uh, and there's a lot that can be said about the Heian period. Um, Many times people will point to the flourishing of arts and literature that took place during this period. Famous examples being Genji Monogatari or Sei Shonagon's Makuda no Soshi, the Pillow Book. There's lots of different things, anyway, that could be said and investigated in the Heian period. But today in this talk, I'm just going to focus on mainly some of the politics of the Heian period and look at how leaders of that time and the court royals, and nobles utilized forms of conquest, and also the arts and religion to solidify their political power and rule. So let's get started. Okay, so I've titled this talk Heian Politics, Conquest, Art, and Religion. Not because particularly there's any special relation between these three, but mainly just because these are three of the examples that I will be focusing on in particular. I want to start with the Emishi Wars, and by looking at the Emishi Wars. Now, when Emperor Kanmu moved the capital to Heian-kyo, today known as Kyoto, in 795, the central government and Yamato rulers were already involved in a series of ongoing wars with people in the north part of Honshu, the main island of Japan, who were simply called by Yamato rulers at that time the Emishi. And the entire northern part of Honshu, from Fukushima on up, was not yet under the control of the central government. And this was instead occupied by Emishi. And these people later, after eventually having most of their land colonized by the Japanese, eventually moved to Ezochi, today known as Hokkaido, and became started the beginnings of Ainu culture as well. But there was, for this period of 30 years, beginning in 780, there had been a conflict between the Emishi and the Japanese, as the Japanese were pushing further north into Emishi territory. There had been actually relations between Yamato rulers, Yamato court, and the Emishi since as early as the 4th century, but they didn't really start to come into major conflict until around this time. And in 1801 and 1802, for instance, there was a major shift in the battle, and Sakanoue no Tamuda Mado, the Japanese leader, defeated the Emishi leader Atedui. And Tamuda Mado led a large army of 40,000 troops against Atedui, and his small band of only 500 fighters. And Atedui and his partner Mode were captured and then taken to Kyoto. And in fact, Tamada Amado rather respected Atedui and Mode, respected them for their fighting skills, especially, and he pleaded with the central government and the court to allow them to live, and in fact to go back and to fight on the Japanese side. But the central government refused and eventually executed Atedui and Mode in Kawachi province, which is today part of Osaka. So after this then, and this had already been ongoing, but Japanese efforts to assimilate the Emishi and to colonize the area progressed. The Japanese established these militarized fort cities, and these were all along the border areas as Japan was pushing forward, trying to control more of northern Honshu. Some Emishi who were captured became the slaves of nobles, but many others were simply forced to live in special communities, segregated communities. And some were also recruited, sorry, this is a spell error, but should be recruited, as warriors who would then fight with the Japanese. But there were continued revolts and attempts at revolts against Japanese rule and attempts at Emishi independence through up until 1087. And at the same time, also the local Fujiwara, the northern Fujiwara family had intermarried with Emishi families, and they too remained independent from the central government until they were eventually defeated by Minamoto Yoritomo in 1189. And this is a later scroll painting from 1069, but it depicts some Emishi paying tribute to Shotoku Taishi, to Prince Shotoku. So this illustrates, that the Japanese, the Yamato rulers, and the Emishi had already been in contact for some time, for many centuries. And it also shows at the same time, the Yamato rulers' kind of sense of superiority over the more subservient, who are depicted here as being subservient Emishi, and who are bowing to pay tribute to Prince Shotoku. Now today, if you go to Kiyomizu-dera, Kiyomizu Temple, there is this rather intriguing monument dedicated to the two Emishi leaders in the war, in the famous battle of 1801, and this is dedicated to Atedui and Mode, the two leaders. And there's also an explanation, of who they were, and it's dedicated in commemoration to these two. Describes the Japanese conquest of Emishi lands in a rather critical way, using the word shinryaku, so describing it as a conquest or invasion. And then it talks about Tamada Amado's efforts to convince the court to be lenient on Atedui and Mode, although he was ultimately unsuccessful. And this monument was built in rather recently, relatively, in 1904, on the 1100th anniversary of the establishment of Heian Kyo of Kyoto. It was built by a group called the Society to Honor Atedui, and then with support of other kind of Friends of Iwate group who are living in the Kansai area. But anyway, this kind of demonstrates how memories of this event continue to live on kind of in the background, definitely. This is certainly not the main attraction at Kiyomizu Temple. It's very much off to the side, actually, and I don't think so many visitors even know what it is. But for many people in Japan, it does show how memories of this battle and memories of Emishi and later of Ainu peoples and culture, continue to be present, and people continue to reflect on that. And occasionally, more and more, I think, are critically reevaluating that history there. Okay, I want to move on to tell kind of look at another example then. So we've looked at then this kind of political conquest through violence and colonization, but I want to move on and look at what I guess could be called a politics of art, and how examples of how art was used to kind of reinforce Japanese leaders' rule. And I want to talk about the case of Fujiwara power, and especially Sugawara no Michizane. Now, it's well known that during most of this period, the emperors kind of shared the burden of power with the Fujiwara family to different extents at different times. Sometimes Fujiwara family having more power, sometimes less. But this is the period generally known as Seikan Seiji, or rule by regency. So these Fujiwara regents would, for much of the Heian period, would rule as regents in the stead of the emperor, who many times was just a child emperor. But some emperors did attempt to exert more of their own power and to gain more influence than the Fujiwara family. And one such emperor to do so was the Emperor Uda, who appointed Sugawara no Michizane as the minister of the right. And this is then shared with minister of the left as the two highest kind of ranks of state under the emperor. And Sugawara no Michizane had a less contact and less connections with the Fujiwara. So this was an attempt of Emperor Uda to kind of break the influence that the Fujiwara had over the court. But this attracted a lot of resentment, of course, from the Fujiwara family, most notably from the minister of the left, Fujiwara no Tokihira. And he was able to convince the next emperor, Daigo, that Michizane was plotting against the court. And so Daigo then exiled Michizane to Kyushu, and where 2 years later he died. And he, of course, Michizane was not happy being exiled, and he wrote about how sad he was during his time in exile, as we'll see in a minute, through various kinds of poetry. But after then he died, a series of subsequent calamities struck the court and the Tokihira family, including in 930, a lightning storm on the palace that killed members of court. And these were attributed to Michizane's vengeful spirit. So this really demonstrates the religious beliefs of people at the time as well. That these spirits could come back and exercise power over the living. And this was very much intertwined with the politics of the day. So a special shrine then was established to kind of pacify Michizane's vengeful spirit. And this was the Kitano Shrine, or Kitano Tenmangu, and where Michizane then in 940 became worshipped as a god of thunder and lightning. And this was, again, an attempt to kind of pacify him so that he didn't, or that he could be kind of rendered safe and not exert any more political power over the court from beyond the dead. These are some examples of Michizane's poetry, and this would be an example also of how art and literature were very much intertwined with the politics of the day. So Michizane wrote during his exile, for instance, a poem titled Of Myself, which reads, "Since leaving home 3 or 4 months, streaks of falling tears, hundreds and thousands, all things just like a dream. Constantly I look up and plead to heaven." So, really strongly desiring to return back to the capital and this unhappiness at being exiled and having to live away from where he wants to be. He also wrote, "Autumn night, the 15th day of the 9th month. My complexion a withered yellow, topped by white frost. Worse still, I am banished over 1,000 li from home. Once ensnared in the trappings of glory, now I am an exile imprisoned amid rustic weeds. The moon, shining like a mirror, exposes no crime. The wind, blowing with sword-like force, cannot end my protests. Looking or listening, both make me shiver. This year's autumn is my own personal autumn." So he's talking about how his health is declining, and demonstrating this great, grief and unhappiness. And then he also continues to protest his innocence, saying that, this was an elaborate setup against him, and that he was not plotting against the court. And he continues to protest this until his final days. And then this event, then the idea of Michizane coming back as a vengeful spirit to attack the court in this lightning storm, and how he supposedly became the god of thunder, was later depicted in various artistic representations, such as this picture scroll, Kitano Tenjin Engi Emaki, from 1219, which is now a national treasure at Kitano Shrine in Kyoto. But you can see here he's been completely deified and is wreaking havoc through his lightning bolts on the court. Okay, and then lastly, I want to look at a little bit about some of the ways that religion and politics were intertwined, or religion and governance, you could say. And under the Ritsuryo system, directly underneath the emperor, in addition to ministers of the left and right, there was also, on the other hand, the Council for Kami Affairs, known as the Jingikan. So this was an entirely religious organization in which the emperor kind of held this position of the head of Buddhism and Shinto and religion at the time. And also notably, the connections between religion and politics and how closely they were intertwined is emphasized through the word that was used to refer to politics at the time, Matsuri Goto. Matsuri here, though, referring more to religious aspects and religious rites. But the whole term is used to talk about politics in general. At this time, the kami were fully subsumed into Buddhism. This was known as Shinbutsu Shugo. So it's quite hard to distinguish between where Shinto ended and Buddhism began. It's probably not even necessary to do so. People at the time didn't distinguish between them. But in any case, also members of the royal family, royal princesses, for instance, would serve as priestesses. Members of the royal family in the court would frequently be heads of temples. Required emperors would often, if they entered a Buddhist practice after retiring, would be referred to as Dharma kings or Ho. So they political leaders were simultaneously religious leaders. This was not the only source of power, though. There were different blocks of power that were competing for control in Japan at this time. The court was one, the shrine temple complexes was another, and military houses. And different regional lords and also Fujiwara leaders too would dedicate shrines to themselves or to former members of their family, or they would install themselves as head of the temple complexes. And these were all an attempt to kind of exercise their own autonomy and to venerate their own family lineage in order to exercise power. Retired emperors, again, are doing the same. And then after, members of their own lineage or their own kind of local gods or deities were enshrined in their different regional shrine temple complexes, then they would also compete to have royal pilgrimages come there because this would, of course, garner them much legitimacy. And the royal pilgrimages, for their own part, functioned as rather fancy shows of power as well. So in all these ways, there's religion and politics were intimately intertwined as well. Okay, so in conclusion, I just want to point out that the Heian period has kind of an image, I think, of peace and stability. People often think of the Heian period and Tokugawa period as being these two long times of relative peace and stability, and also flourishing of the arts. This is certainly true, of course, to an extent, but as I wanted to point out in this lecture, it was also underwritten by much political turmoil and violence and struggles for power that were going on in the background. And as I tried to illustrate or show, this was illustrated through various conquests that were happening at the time, at the very establishment of Heian-kyo. And it was depicted in arts and religion as well. Okay, so that is the end of our talk for today. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it somewhat enlightening. I just tried to highlight some aspects of the Heian period that sometimes might go overlooked, and especially to focus on the importance of politics and how leaders used religion, arts, and conquest and violence to solidify their political rule. So, thank you very much for listening.